You know what's weird about studying dinosaurs? We spend so much time focused on the obvious stuff. The teeth, the claws, the size, how fast they could run, what they could eat, which ones could rip you apart in seconds. But every once in a while, paleontologists stumble upon behavior that's so bizarre, so utterly insane, that it makes you wonder what the hell evolution was thinking. And nowhere is this more apparent than with a group of dinosaurs that looked like they were specifically designed for one purpose: smashing their heads into each other as hard as physically possible. Welcome to the world of Pachycephalosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs, and their absolutely brutal mating rituals. I'm talking about dinosaurs with skulls so thick, so reinforced, so over-engineered that the only logical explanation is that they spent a significant portion of their lives literally ramming their heads together at full speed. For what? Dominance, territory, and most importantly, the right to mate. These animals turned their own skulls into biological battering rams, and the evidence suggests they did it over and over and over again throughout their lives. Some scientists call it the most extreme mating display in dinosaur history. Others aren't even sure it happened at all. And that's what makes this story so fascinating, because we're still arguing about whether these dinosaurs actually did the thing their skulls seem obviously designed to do. Buckle up, this is going to get violent. Let's start with what we know for sure. Pachycephalosaurs were a group of herbivorous dinosaurs that lived during the Late Cretaceous period, roughly 70 to 66 million years ago. They weren't particularly large. Most species ranged from about 3 to 15 feet long, or roughly 1 to 4.5 meters. They walked on 2 legs, had relatively small arms, and from the neck down, they looked fairly unremarkable. But then you get to the head, and that's where things get weird. The defining feature of Pachycephalosaurs was their skull, specifically the dome. The top of their head was covered in a thick, rounded mass of solid bone that could reach up to 10 inches or 25 centimeters thick, 10 inches of pure bone on top of their brain. And surrounding this dome were often smaller bony knobs, spikes, and ridges that gave them a crown-like appearance. 10 inches of bone. A weapon. A warning. The most famous example is Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis itself, the big one, the poster child of the group. This thing had a skull dome so massive, so absurdly thick, that when paleontologists first found it, they genuinely couldn't figure out what purpose it could possibly serve. It seemed like overkill, literally. And here's where the debate begins. In 1955, paleontologist Edwin Kolber looked at these domed skulls and proposed what seemed like an obvious hypothesis. These dinosaurs were headbutting each other, just like modern bighorn sheep. The skulls were clearly reinforced, the domes were positioned perfectly for impact. The whole setup screamed, "I am designed to smash into things." Case closed, right? Not even close, because almost immediately other scientists pushed back. Hard. They argued that headbutting at high speeds would cause catastrophic brain damage, neck injuries, or death. They pointed out that the skulls, while thick, weren't structured in a way that would properly dissipate impact forces. Some suggested the domes were purely for display, visual signals to attract mates or intimidate rivals without actual contact. Others proposed that maybe they used their heads for flank butting, pushing against each other's sides rather than direct head-to-head collisions. For decades, this debate raged on. Headbutting versus no headbutting became one of the most contentious arguments in paleontology. Scientific papers flew back and forth. Conferences got heated. It was the dinosaur equivalent of "Han shot first." Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was convinced they were right. And then the evidence started piling up. In the early 2000s and 2010s, paleontologists began looking more closely at the skull structure of Pachycephalosaurs using modern technology. CT scans, biomechanical modeling, finite element analysis, all the fancy tools we didn't have back in the 1950s. And what they found was remarkable. First, the bone structure of the dome itself. It's not just thick, it's organized. The bone is arranged in a specific pattern with dense, compact layers near the surface and a more spongy, shock-absorbing structure underneath. This is exactly the kind of setup you'd expect in an impact-resistant structure. It's engineered, whether intentionally or through evolution, to take repeated hits. Second, the skull base and neck vertebrae show reinforcement. The back of the skull, where it connects to the spine, is thickened and braced. The neck vertebrae in some specimens show adaptations that suggest they were built to handle compressive forces traveling down from the head. This isn't a skull that evolved to just look intimidating. This is a skull built for impact. But here's the smoking gun: pathologies. When scientists started examining multiple Pachycephalosaur skulls in detail, they found something fascinating. Many of them, not all, but a significant percentage, showed evidence of injuries and healing. Lesions on the surface of the dome, bone remodeling, signs of repeated trauma. These weren't catastrophic, life-ending injuries. These were injuries that healed over time, suggesting the dinosaurs survived, recovered, and probably went right back to doing whatever caused the damage in the first place. And the pattern of these injuries? Consistent with head-on impacts. A 2012 study published in PLOS One examined multiple Pachycephalosaurus specimens and found lesions in about 22% of them. That might not sound like a lot, but consider this. We're looking at fossils that are 66 million years old. The fact that we can see healed injuries at all is remarkable. The actual percentage of animals that engaged in this behavior during their lifetime was probably much higher. The scars don't lie. These animals were fighting. So what does this tell us? It tells us that at least some Pachycephalosaurs were absolutely smashing their heads into something hard enough to damage bone, but not hard enough to kill them. And the most likely candidate for something hard is another Pachycephalosaur's head. But why? Why would evolution favor such an apparently dangerous behavior? The answer, as with so many weird animal behaviors, is sex. Here's how we think it worked. During mating season, male Pachycephalosaurs, and we're pretty sure it was primarily males based on sexual dimorphism in some specimens, would compete for access to females. They'd square off, possibly after some preliminary displays and posturing, and then charge at each other head first. The impact would be tremendous. Biomechanical studies suggest that two Pachycephalosaurus males colliding at full speed could generate forces reaching tens of thousands of newtons. That's roughly equivalent to being hit by a professional boxer's punch, except scaled up to a 1-ton reptile and concentrated on the top of your skull. But here's the thing. It probably didn't kill them. The dome structure, as mentioned, was designed to absorb and distribute these forces. The brain was positioned low in the skull, somewhat protected from direct impact. The neck could handle the compression. It would hurt, absolutely. It might cause concussions, but it wouldn't immediately snap their necks or turn their brains into mush, at least not usually. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. Males who could endure more hits, who had stronger skulls, who could win these competitions, would get access to more females and pass on their genes. Over millions of years, this would drive the evolution of increasingly thick, increasingly reinforced skull domes. It's sexual selection at its most literal, quite literally using your head to win mates. Modern analogues support this idea. Bighorn sheep are the most famous example. Males engage in spectacular head-butting contests during mating season, running at each other and colliding with forces that would hospitalize a human. Their skulls are reinforced with a honeycomb structure that absorbs impact, similar to what we see in Pachycephalosaurs. And yes, they do occasionally suffer injuries, but mostly they walk away dazed but alive. Musk oxen do something similar. So do some species of wild goats. In the animal kingdom, using your head as a weapon in mating displays is rare, but not unheard of. And when it does evolve, it creates some of the most spectacular and dangerous courtship behaviors in nature. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Not all Pachycephalosaurs probably fought the same way. Remember, we're not talking about just one species. Pachycephalosauria is an entire family with multiple genera and species. And in 2025, Scientists described Zavacephale rinpoche from Mongolia, the oldest known Pachycephalosaur at roughly 90 million years old. This discovery pushed back the origins of dome-headed dinosaurs and confirmed that this bizarre skull structure evolved early and persisted for at least 25 million years before the end of the Cretaceous. 25 million years of headbutting. That's not an accident. Pachycephalosaurus was the biggest, with the most impressive dome, but there were others. Stegosaurus had a smaller, flatter dome. Prehistorycephale had a differently shaped skull with more pronounced ridges and nodes. Dracorex, which might actually be a juvenile Pachycephalosaurus, but that's a whole other debate, had an array of spikes and horns instead of a smooth dome. Different skull shapes probably meant different fighting styles or display behaviors. Some might have engaged in full-speed head-to-head collisions. Others might have pushed and shoved, using their heads to wrestle for dominance without the running start. Some might have combined head displays with other behaviors, vocalizations, body posturing, maybe even kicking or tail slapping. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that skull shape varied quite a bit, even within species. And this variation might tell us something important about sexual dimorphism, differences between males and females. Some studies have suggested that the most extreme domes belonged to males, while females had flatter, less developed skulls. This would make sense if the primary function was male-male competition. However, this is still debated because juvenile Pachycephalosaurs also had flatter skulls that got thicker as they matured. So is a flat skull a female or a juvenile? Without definitive evidence like finding fossils with preserved reproductive organs or eggs, which basically never happens, it's hard to say for certain. But the weight of evidence increasingly supports the idea that yes, adult males were the primary headbutters, and they were doing it to establish dominance and win mating rights. Now, I know what you're thinking. This seems incredibly stupid and dangerous. Why not just have the females choose mates based on something less likely to cause brain damage? And you're not wrong. From a human perspective, it does seem unnecessarily violent. But evolution doesn't care about what seems reasonable to us. It cares about what works. And apparently, for Pachycephalosaurs, extreme headbutting worked well enough to persist for millions of years. It also raises some fascinating questions about dinosaur behavior and intelligence. Did these animals understand what they were doing? Did they have a concept of risk? Did losing males suffer psychological effects from defeat, the way some modern animals do? Did young males practice on trees or rocks before taking on actual rivals? We'll probably never know the answers to these questions, but the fact that we can ask them at all is pretty incredible. There's also the question of how often these contests happened. Was it a yearly event during mating season, or were there multiple breeding periods? Did the same dominant males maintain their status for years? Or was there constant turnover as injuries accumulated and younger challengers emerged? Did females ever participate in headbutting, or was it purely a male behavior? Recent discoveries keep adding new wrinkles to the story. In 2021, researchers described new Pachycephalosaur specimens from Montana that showed some of the clearest evidence yet of healed cranial injuries. The patterns suggested not just occasional fights, but repeated, sustained combat over time. These weren't animals that butted heads once or twice in their lives. These were animals that did it regularly, possibly dozens or hundreds of times, and that raises another possibility. The behavior may have been neurochemically rewarding. I'm not saying Pachycephalosaurs felt joy in the way we understand it, but from a neurological perspective, behaviors that are crucial for reproductive success often get reinforced with positive feedback. Endorphins, adrenaline, whatever the dinosaur equivalent was. It's possible that these animals were, in some sense, wired to seek out combat, that the rush of the charge, the impact, the victory, triggered reward pathways in their brains. Which means we might be looking at the dinosaur equivalent of adrenaline junkies, creatures that were biologically driven to smash their heads together. Evolution doesn't care about safety, only success, but it also highlights something important about paleontology. We're not just studying dead bones. We're trying to reconstruct living, breathing, behaving animals. And sometimes that means accepting that these animals did things that seem bizarre or dangerous to us, because those behaviors served an evolutionary purpose in their world. The debate about Pachycephalosaur headbutting isn't completely settled. There are still paleontologists who argue for alternative interpretations. Some maintain that the injuries could have come from other sources: falls, predator attacks, accidents. Others suggest that while some head contact occurred, it wasn't as violent or as frequent as the headbutting hypothesis suggests. And you know what? That's okay. That's how science works. We gather evidence, we propose hypotheses, we test them, we argue about interpretations, and gradually we converge on the most likely explanation. The fact that we're still debating this means we're still learning, still discovering new things about these ancient animals. What's not debatable is that Pachycephalosaurs had extraordinary skulls that represent a remarkable adaptation, whether for combat, display, or both. These were animals that invested enormous resources into developing what is essentially biological armor for their heads. That alone tells us something important was happening, even if we're still working out all the details. And here's the really mind-blowing part. This behavior was successful. Pachycephalosaurs existed for at least 25 million years. They spread across North America and Asia. They diversified into multiple species. Whatever they were doing with those domed heads, it worked. Right up until the asteroid hit and ended the Cretaceous, these dome-headed dinosaurs were thriving, which means that somewhere in the Late Cretaceous, on a landscape we can barely imagine, male Pachycephalosaurs were regularly charging at each other, colliding headfirst with bone-crushing force, all for the chance to pass on their genes. And this happened over and over, generation after generation, for millions of years. It sounds insane, but the evidence is carved into their skulls. So the next time someone tells you that dinosaurs were simple, primitive animals, remember the Pachycephalosaurs. Remember the dinosaurs that evolved skulls specifically designed for repeated high-impact collisions. Remember that in the ancient world, love could literally hurt. Not in an emotional way, but in a "I just ran full speed into another dinosaur's skull dome" way. And remember that we figured this out not by watching them, but by studying 66-million-year-old bones and using science, logic, and a lot of educated guesses to reconstruct one of the most bizarre mating rituals in the history of life on Earth. Thanks for watching. And remember, before there were bighorn sheep ramming heads in the mountains, there were dome-headed dinosaurs doing the exact same thing in the Cretaceous. Love left its mark in cracked skulls and healed bone. Evolution never promised romance would be gentle. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go appreciate the fact that human mating rituals don't involve running head-first into each other at full speed. Though given some of the stuff we do for love, maybe we're not that different after all.